Section 6 of Chapter 20 of A History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Stephanie Lee. History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay. Chapter 20. Section 6. The truth was that the change which the Revolution had made in the situation of the House of Commons had made another change necessary, and that other change had not yet taken place. There was parliamentary government, but there was no ministry, and without a ministry the working of a parliamentary government such as ours must always be unsteady and unsafe. It is essential to our liberties that the House of Commons should exercise a control over all the departments of the executive administration. And yet it is evident that a crowd of 500 or 600 people, even if they were intellectually much above the average of the members of the best Parliament, even if every one of them was a Burleigh or a Sully, would be unfit for executive functions. It has been truly said that every large collection of human beings, however well educated, has a strong tendency to become a mob, and a country of which the Supreme Executive Council is a mob is surely in a perilous situation. Happily a way has been found out in which the House of Commons can exercise a paramount influence over the executive government without assuming functions such as can never be well discharged by a body so numerous and so variously composed. An institution which did not exist in the times of the Plantagenets, of the Tudors, or of the Stuarts, an institution not known to the law, an institution not mentioned in any statute, an institution of which such writers as Delorme and Blackstone take no notice, began to exist a few years after the Revolution, grew rapidly into importance, became firmly established, and is now almost as essential a part of our polity as the Parliament itself. This institution is the Ministry. The Ministry is, in fact, a committee of leading members of the two Houses. It is nominated by the Crown, but it consists exclusively of statesmen whose opinions on the pressing questions of the time agree, in the main, with the opinions of the majority of the House of Commons. Among the members of this committee are distributed the great departments of the administration. Each minister conducts the ordinary business of his own office without reference to his colleagues. But the most important business of every office, and especially such business as is likely to be the subject of discussion in Parliament, is brought under the consideration of the whole ministry. In Parliament the ministers are bound to act as one man on all questions relating to the executive government. If one of them dissents from the rest on a question too important to admit of compromise, it is his duty to retire. While the ministers retain the confidence of the parliamentary majority, that majority supports them against opposition, and rejects every motion which reflects on them or is likely to embarrass them. If they forfeit that confidence, if the parliamentary majority is dissatisfied with the way in which patronage is distributed, with the way in which the prerogative of mercy is used, with the conduct of foreign affairs, with the conduct of a war, the remedy is simple. It is not necessary that the Commons should take on themselves the business of administration, that they should request the Crown to make this man a bishop and that man a judge, to pardon one criminal and to execute another, to negotiate a treaty on a particular basis, or to send an expedition to a particular place. They have merely to declare that they have ceased to trust the ministry, and to ask for a ministry which they can trust. It is by means of ministries thus constituted, and thus changed, that the English government has long been conducted in general conformity with the deliberate sense of the House of Commons, and yet has been wonderfully free from the vices which are characteristic of governments administered by large, tumultuous, and divided assemblies. A few distinguished persons, agreeing in their general opinions, are the confidential advisers at once of the sovereign and of the estates of the realm. In the closet they speak with the authority of men who stand high in the esteem of the representatives of the people. In Parliament they speak with the authority of men versed in great affairs, and acquainted with all the secrets of the state. Thus the cabinet has something of the popular character of a representative body, and the representative body has something of the gravity of a cabinet. Sometimes the state of parties is such that no set of men who can be brought together possesses the full confidence and steady support of a majority of the House of Commons. When this is the case, there must be a weak ministry, and there will probably be a rapid succession of weak ministries. At such times the House of Commons never fails to get into a state which no person friendly to representative government can contemplate without uneasiness, into a state which may enable us to form some faint notion of the state of that House during the earlier years of the reign of William. The notion is indeed but faint, for the weakest ministry has great power as a regulator of parliamentary proceedings, and in the earlier years of the reign of William there was no ministry at all. No writer has yet attempted to trace the progress of this institution, an institution indispensable to the harmonious working of our other institutions. The first ministry was the work, partly of mere chance and partly of wisdom, not, however, of that highest wisdom which is conversant with great principles of political philosophy, but of that lower wisdom which meets daily exigencies by daily expedients. Neither William nor the most enlightened of his advisers fully understood the nature and importance of that noiseless revolution, for it was no less, which began about the close of 1693, and was completed about the close of 1696. But every body could perceive that, at the close of 1693, the chief offices in the government were distributed not unequally between the two great parties, that the men who held those offices were perpetually caballing against each other, haranguing against each other, moving votes of censure on each other, exhibiting articles of impeachment against each other, and that the temper of the House of Commons was wild, ungovernable, and uncertain. Everybody could perceive that at the close of 1696 all the principal servants of the Crown were Whigs, closely bound together by public and private ties, and prompt to defend one another against every attack, and that the majority of the House of Commons was arrayed in good order under those leaders, and had learned to move, like one man, at the word of command. The history of the period of transition and of the steps by which the change was effected is in a high degree curious and interesting. The statesman who had the chief share in forming the first English ministry had once been but too well known, but had long hidden himself from the public gaze, and had but recently emerged from the obscurity in which it had been expected that he would pass the remains of an ignominious and disastrous life. During the period of general terror and confusion which followed the flight of James, Sunderland had disappeared. It was high time, for of all the agents of the fallen government he was, with the single exception of Jeffreys, the most odious to the nation. Few knew that Sunderland's voice had in secret been given against the spoliation of Magdalen College and the prosecution of the bishops, but all knew that he had signed numerous instruments dispensing with statutes, that he had sat in the High Commission, that he had turned or pretended to turn Papist, that he had, a few days after his apostasy, appeared in Westminster Hall as a witness against the oppressed fathers of the Church. He had indeed atoned for many crimes by one crime baser than all the rest. As soon as he had reason to believe that the day of deliverance and retribution was at hand, he had, by a most dexterous and seasonable treason, earned his pardon. During the 3 months which preceded the arrival of the Dutch armament in Torbay, he had rendered to the cause of liberty and of the Protestant religion services of which it is difficult to overrate either the wickedness or the utility. To him chiefly it was owing that, at the most critical moment in our history, a French army was not menacing the Batavian frontier, and a French fleet hovering about the English coast. William could not, without staining his own honour, refuse to protect one whom he had not scrupled to employ. Yet it was no easy task even for William to save that guilty head from the first outbreak of public fury, for even those extreme politicians of both sides who agreed in nothing else agreed in calling for vengeance on the renegade. The Whigs hated him as the vilest of the slaves by whom the late government had been served, and the Jacobites as the vilest of the traitors by whom it had been overthrown. Had he remained in England, he would probably have died by the hand of the executioner, if indeed the executioner had not been anticipated by the populace. But in Holland a political refugee, favoured by the stadtholder, might hope to live unmolested. To Holland Sunderland fled, disguised, it is said, as a woman, and his wife accompanied him. At Rotterdam, a town devoted to the House of Orange, he thought himself secure. But the magistrates were not in all the secrets of the prince, and were assured by some busy Englishmen that his Highness would be delighted to hear of the arrest of the Popish dog, the Judas, whose appearance on Tower Hill was impatiently expected by all London. Sunderland was thrown into prison, and remained there till an order for his release arrived from Whitehall. He then proceeded to Amsterdam, and there changed his religion again. His second apostasy edified his wife as much as his first apostasy had edified his master. The Countess wrote to assure her pious friends in England that her poor dear lord's heart had at last been really touched by divine grace, and that, in spite of all her afflictions, she was comforted by seeing him so true a convert. We may, however, without any violation of Christian charity, suspect that he was still the same false, callous Sunderland, who, a few months before, had made Bon Repos shudder by denying the existence of a God, and had, at the same time, won the heart of James by pretending to believe in transubstantiation. In a short time the banished man put forth an apology for his conduct. This apology, when examined, will be found to amount merely to a confession that he had committed one series of crimes in order to gain James's favour, and another series in order to avoid being involved in James's ruin. The writer concluded by announcing his intention to pass all the rest of his life in penitence and prayer. He soon retired from Amsterdam to Utrecht, and at Utrecht made himself conspicuous by his regular and devout attendance on the ministrations of Huguenot preachers. If his letters and those of his wife were to be trusted, he had done for ever with ambition. He longed indeed to be permitted to return from exile, not that he might again enjoy and dispense the favours of the crown, not that his antechambers might again be filled by the daily swarm of suitors, but that he might see again the turf, the trees, and the family pictures of his country seat. His only wish was to be suffered to end his troubled life at Althorpe, and he would be content to forfeit his head if ever he went beyond the palings of his park. While the House of Commons, which had been elected during the vacancy of the throne, was busily engaged in the work of proscription, he could not venture to show himself in England. But when that assembly had ceased to exist, he thought himself safe. He returned a few days after the Act of Grace had been laid on the table of the Lords. From the benefit of that act he was by name excluded, but he well knew that he had now nothing to fear. He went privately to Kensington, was admitted into the closet, had an audience which lasted 2 hours, and then retired to his country house. During many months he led a secluded life, and had no residence in London. Once in the spring of 1692, to the great astonishment of the public, he showed his face in the circle at court, and was graciously received. He seems to have been afraid that he might, on his reappearance in Parliament, receive some marked affront. He therefore very prudently stole down to Westminster in the dead time of the year, on a day to which the Houses stood adjourned by the royal command, and on which they met merely for the purpose of adjourning again. Sunderland had just time to present himself, to take the oaths, to sign the declaration against transubstantiation, and to resume his seat. None of the few peers who were present had an opportunity of making any remark. It was not till the year 1692 that he began to attend regularly. He was silent, but silent he had always been in large assemblies, even when he was at the zenith of power. His talents were not those of a public speaker. The art in which he surpassed all men was the art of whispering. His tact, his quick eye for the foibles of individuals, his caressing manners, his power of insinuation, and, above all, his apparent frankness, made him irresistible in private conversation. By means of these qualities he had governed James, and now aspired to govern William. To govern William, indeed, was not easy, but Sunderland succeeded in obtaining such a measure of favour and influence as excited much surprise and some indignation. In truth, scarcely any mind was strong enough to resist the witchery of his talk and of his manners. Every man is prone to believe in the gratitude and attachment even of the most worthless persons on whom he has conferred great benefits. It can therefore hardly be thought strange that the most skilful of all flatterers should have been heard with favour, when he, with every outward sign of strong emotion, implored permission to dedicate all his faculties to the service of the generous protector to whom he owed property, liberty, life. It is not necessary, however, to suppose that the king was deceived. He may have thought, with good reason, that though little confidence could be placed in Sunderland's professions, much confidence might be placed in Sunderland's situation, and the truth is that Sunderland proved, on the whole, a more faithful servant than a much less depraved man might have been. He did indeed make, in profound secrecy, some timid overtures towards a reconciliation with James. But it may be confidently affirmed that, even had those overtures been graciously received, and they appear to have been received very ungraciously, the twice-turned renegade would never have rendered any real service to the Jacobite cause. He well knew that he had done that which at St. Germain's must be regarded as inexpiable. It was not merely that he had been treacherous and ungrateful. Marlborough had been as treacherous and ungrateful, and Marlborough had been pardoned, but Marlborough had not been guilty of the impious hypocrisy of counterfeiting the signs of conversion. Marlborough had not pretended to be convinced by the arguments of the Jesuits, to be touched by divine grace, to pine for union with the only true Church. Marlborough had not, when Popery was in the ascendant, crossed himself, shrived himself, done penance, taken the communion in one kind, and as soon as a turn of fortune came, apostatized back again, and proclaimed to all the world that, when he knelt at the confessional and received the host, he was merely laughing at the king and the priests. The crime of Sunderland was one which could never be forgiven by James, and a crime which could never be forgiven by James was, in some sense, a recommendation to William. The court, nay the council, was full of men who might hope to prosper if the banished king were restored. But Sunderland had left himself no retreat. He had broken down all the bridges behind him. He had been so false to one side that he must of necessity be true to the other. That he was in the main true to the government which now protected him there is no reason to doubt, and being true he could not but be useful. He was, in some respects, eminently qualified to be at that time an adviser of the crown. He had exactly the talents and the knowledge which William wanted. The two together would have made up a consummate statesman. The master was capable of forming and executing large designs, but was negligent of those small arts in which the servant excelled. The master saw farther off than other men, but what was near no man saw so clearly as the servant. The master, though profoundly versed in the politics of the great community of nations, never thoroughly understood the politics of his own kingdom. The servant was perfectly well informed as to the temper and the organization of the English factions, and as to the strong and weak parts of the character of every Englishman of note. Early in 1693 it was rumoured that Sunderland was consulted on all important questions relating to the internal administration of the realm, and the rumour became stronger when it was known that he had come up to London in the autumn before the meeting of Parliament, and that he had taken a large mansion near Whitehall. The coffee-house politicians were confident that he was about to hold some high office. As yet, however, he had the wisdom to be content with the reality of power, and to leave the show to others. His opinion was that, as long as the king tried to balance the two great parties against each other, and to divide his favour equally between them, both would think themselves ill-used, and neither would lend to the government that hearty and steady support which was now greatly needed. His Majesty must make up his mind to give a marked preference to one or the other, and there were three weighty reasons for giving the preference to the Whigs. End of section 6.
Section 7 of Chapter 20 of A History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay, Chapter 20, Section 7. In the first place, the Whigs were on principle attached to the reigning dynasty. In their view the revolution had been, not merely necessary, not merely justifiable, but happy and glorious. It had been the triumph of their political theory. When they swore allegiance to William, they swore without scruple or reservation, and they were so far from having any doubt about his title that they thought it the best of all titles. The Tories, on the other hand, very generally disapproved of that vote of the Convention which had placed him on the throne. Some of them were at heart Jacobites, and had taken the oath of allegiance to him only that they might be able to injure him. Others, though they thought it their duty to obey him as king in fact, denied that he was king by right, and if they were loyal to him, were loyal without enthusiasm. There could, therefore, be little doubt on which of the two parties it would be safer for him to rely. In the second place, as to the particular matter on which his heart was at present set, the Whigs were, as a body, prepared to support him strenuously, and the Tories were, as a body, inclined to thwart him. The minds of men were at this time much occupied by the question in what way the war ought to be carried on. To that question the two parties returned very different answers. An opinion had during many months been growing among the Tories that the policy of England ought to be strictly insular, and that she ought to leave the defence of Flanders and the Rhines to the States General, the House of Austria, and the princes of the Empire, that she ought to carry on hostilities with vigour by sea, but to keep up only such an army as might, with the help of the militia, be sufficient to repel an invasion. It was plain that, if this system were adopted, there might be an immediate reduction of the taxes which pressed most heavily on the nation. But the Whigs maintained that this relief would be dearly purchased. Many thousands of brave English soldiers were now in Flanders, yet the allies had not been able to prevent the French from taking Mons in 1691, Namur in 1692, Charleroi in 1693. If the English troops were withdrawn, it was certain that Ostend, Ghent, Liège, Brussels would fall. The German princes would hasten to make peace, each for himself. The Spanish Netherlands would probably be annexed to the French monarchy. The United Provinces would be again in as great peril as in 1672, and would accept whatever terms Lewis might be pleased to dictate. In a few months he would be at liberty to put forth his whole strength against our island. Then would come a struggle for life and death. It might well be hoped that we should be able to defend our soil even against such a general and such an army as had won the Battle of Landen. But the fight must be long and hard. How many fertile counties would be turned into deserts? How many flourishing towns would be laid in ashes before the invaders were destroyed or driven out? One triumphant campaign in Kent and Middlesex would do more to impoverish the nation than 10 disastrous campaigns in Brabant. It is remarkable that this dispute between the two great factions was, during 70 years, regularly revived as often as our country was at war with France. That England ought never to attempt great military operations on the Continent continued to be a fundamental article of the creed of the Tories till the French Revolution produced a complete change in their feelings. As the chief object of William was to open the campaign of 1694 in Flanders with an immense display of force, it was sufficiently clear to whom he must look for assistance. In the third place, the Whigs were the stronger party in Parliament. The general election of 1690 indeed had not been favourable to them. They had been, for a time, a minority, but they had ever since been constantly gaining ground. They were now in number a full half of the lower house, and their effective strength was more than proportioned to their number, for in energy, alertness and discipline they were decidedly superior to their opponents. Their organisation was not indeed so perfect as it afterwards became, but they had already begun to look for guidance to a small knot of distinguished men which was long afterwards widely known by the name of the Junto. There is perhaps no parallel in history, ancient or modern, to the authority exercised by this council during 20 troubled years over the Whig body. The men who acquired that authority in the days of William and Mary continued to possess it without interruption, in office and out of office, till George I was on the throne. One of these men was Russell. Of his shameful dealings with the court of Saint-Germain we possess proofs which leave no room for doubt. But no such proofs were laid before the world till he had been many years dead. If rumours of his guilt got abroad, they were vague and improbable. They rested on no evidence. They could be traced to no trustworthy author, and they might well be regarded by his contemporaries as Jacobite calumnies. What was quite certain was that he sprang from an illustrious house which had done and suffered great things for liberty and for the Protestant religion, that he had signed the invitation of the 30th of June, that he had landed with the Deliverer at Torbay, that he had in Parliament on all occasions spoken and voted as a zealous Whig, that he had won a great victory, that he had saved his country from an invasion, and that since he had left the Admiralty everything had gone wrong. We cannot therefore wonder that his influence over his party should have been considerable. But the greatest man among the members of the junto, and in some respects the greatest man of that age, was the Lord Keeper Somers. He was equally eminent as a jurist and as a politician, as an orator and as a writer. His speeches have perished, but his state papers remain, and are models of terse, luminous, and dignified eloquence. He had left a great reputation in the House of Commons, where he had, during 4 years, been always heard with delight, and the Whig members still looked up to him as their leader, and still held their meetings under his roof. In the great place to which he had recently been promoted, he had so borne himself that, after a very few months, even faction and envy had ceased to murmur at his elevation. In truth, he united all the qualities of a great judge: an intellect comprehensive, quick and acute, diligence, integrity, patience, suavity. In counsel, the calm wisdom which he possessed in a measure rarely found among men of parts so quick and of opinions so decided as his, acquired for him the authority of an oracle. The superiority of his powers appeared not less clearly in private circles. The charm of his conversation was heightened by the frankness with which he poured out his thoughts. His good temper and his good breeding never failed. His gesture, his look, his tones were expressive of benevolence. His humanity was the more remarkable because he had received from nature a body such as is generally found united with a peevish and irritable mind. His life was one long malady. His nerves were weak, his complexion was livid, his face was prematurely wrinkled. Yet his enemies could not pretend that he had ever once, during a long and troubled public life, been goaded, even by sudden provocation, into vehemence inconsistent with the mild dignity of his character. All that was left to them was to assert that his disposition was very far from being so gentle as the world believed, that he was really prone to the angry passions, and that sometimes, while his voice was soft and his words kind and courteous, his delicate frame was almost convulsed by suppressed emotion. It will perhaps be thought that this reproach is the highest of all eulogies. The most accomplished men of those times have told us that there was scarcely any subject on which Somers was not competent to instruct and to delight. He had never travelled, and in that age an Englishman who had not travelled was generally thought incompetent to give an opinion on works of art. But connoisseurs familiar with the masterpieces of the Vatican and of the Florentine Gallery allowed that the taste of Somers in painting and sculpture was exquisite. Philology was one of his favourite pursuits. He had traversed the whole vast range of polite literature, ancient and modern. He was at once a munificent and severely judicious patron of genius and learning. Locke owned opulence to Somers. By Somers, Addison was drawn forth from a cell in a college. In distant countries the name of Somers was mentioned with respect and gratitude by great scholars and poets who had never seen his face. He was the benefactor of Leclerc. He was the friend of Filicaja. Neither political nor religious differences prevented him from extending his powerful protection to merit. Hickes, the fiercest and most intolerant of all the nonjurors, obtained, by the influence of Somers, permission to study Teutonic antiquities in freedom and safety. Vertue, a strict Roman Catholic, was raised by the discriminating and liberal patronage of Somers from poverty and obscurity to the first rank among the engravers of the age. The generosity with which Somers treated his opponents was the more honourable to him because he was no waverer in politics. From the beginning to the end of his public life he was a steady Whig. His voice was indeed always raised, when his party was dominant in the state, against violent and vindictive counsels, but he never forsook his friends, even when their perverse neglect of his advice had brought them to the verge of ruin. His powers of mind and his acquirements were not denied even by his detractors. The most acrimonious Tories were forced to admit, with an ungracious snarl, which increased the value of their praise, that he had all the intellectual qualities of a great man, and that in him alone, among his contemporaries, brilliant eloquence and wit were to be found associated with the quiet and steady prudence which ensures success in life. It is a remarkable fact that in the foulest of all the many libels that were published against him, he was slandered under the name of Cicero. As his abilities could not be questioned, he was charged with irreligion and immorality. That he was heterodox, all the country vicars and fox-hunting squires firmly believed. But as to the nature and extent of his heterodoxy, there were many different opinions. He seems to have been a low churchman of the school of Tillotson, whom he always loved and honoured, and he was, like Tillotson, called by bigots a Presbyterian, an Arian, a Socinian, a Deist, and an atheist. The private life of this great statesman and magistrate was malignantly scrutinized, and tales were told about his libertinism, which went on growing till they became too absurd for the credulity even of party spirit. At last, long after he had been condemned to flannel and kitchen broth, a wretched courtesan, who had probably never seen him except in the stage box at the theatre when she was following her vocation below in a mask, published a lampoon in which she described him as the master of a harem more costly than the Great Turk's. There is, however, reason to believe that there was a small nucleus of truth round which this great mass of fiction gathered, and that the wisdom and self-command which Somers never wanted in the Senate, on the judgment seat, at the council board, or in the society of wits, scholars, and philosophers, were not always proof against female attractions. Another director of the Whig party was Charles Montague. He was often, when he had risen to power, honours, and riches, called an upstart by those who envied his success. That they should have called him so may seem strange, for few of the statesmen of his time could show such a pedigree as his. He sprang from a family as old as the Conquest. He was in the succession to an earldom, and was, by the paternal side, cousin of 3 earls. But he was the younger son of a younger brother, and that phrase had, ever since the time of Shakespeare and Raleigh, and perhaps before their time, been proverbially used to designate a person so poor as to be broken to the most abject servitude, or ready for the most desperate adventure. Charles Montague was early destined for the Church, was entered on the foundation of Westminster, and after distinguishing himself there by skill in Latin versification, was sent up to Trinity College, Cambridge. At Cambridge, the philosophy of Descartes was still dominant in the schools, but a few select spirits had separated from the crowd and formed a fit audience round a far greater teacher. Conspicuous among the youths of high promise who were proud to sit at the feet of Newton was the quick and versatile Montague. Under such guidance the young student made considerable proficiency in the severe sciences. But poetry was his favourite pursuit, and when the University invited her sons to celebrate royal marriages and funerals, he was generally allowed to have surpassed his competitors. His fame travelled to London. He was thought a clever lad by the wits who met at Will's, and the lively parody which he wrote in concert with his friend and fellow student Prior on Dryden's Hind and Panther was received with great applause. All this time Montague's wishes pointed towards the Church. At a later period, when he was a peer with 12,000 a year, when his villa on the Thames was regarded as the most delightful of all suburban retreats, when he was said to revel in Tokay from the imperial cellar, and in soups made out of birds' nests brought from the Indian Ocean and costing 3 guineas apiece, his enemies were fond of reminding him that there had been a time when he had eked out by his wits an income of barely £50, when he had been happy with a trencher of mutton chops and a flagon of ale from the college buttery, and when a tithe pig was the rarest luxury for which he had dared to hope. The Revolution came and changed his whole scheme of life. He obtained, by the influence of Dorset, who took a peculiar pleasure in befriending young men of promise, a seat in the House of Commons. Still, during a few months, the needy scholar hesitated between politics and divinity. But it soon became clear that, in the new order of things, parliamentary ability must fetch a higher price than any other kind of ability, and he felt in parliamentary ability he had no superior. He was in the very situation for which he was peculiarly fitted by nature, and during some years his life was a series of triumphs. Of him, as of several of his contemporaries, especially of Mulgrave and of Sprat, it may be said that his fame has suffered from the folly of those editors who, down to our own time, have persisted in reprinting his rhymes among the works of the British poets. There is not a year in which hundreds of verses as good as any that he ever wrote are not sent in for the Newdigate Prize at Oxford and for the Chancellor's Medal at Cambridge. His mind had indeed great quickness and vigour, but not that kind of quickness and vigour which produces great dramas or odes, and it is most unjust to him that his Loan of Honour and his Epistle on the Battle of the Boyne should be placed side by side with Comus and Alexander's Feast. Other eminent statesmen and orators, Walpole, Pulteney, Chatham, Fox, wrote poetry not better than his, but fortunately for them their metrical compositions were never thought worthy to be admitted into any collection of our national classics. It has long been usual to represent the imagination under the figure of a wing, and to call the successful exertions of the imagination flights. One poet is the eagle, another is the swan, a third modestly compares himself to the bee. But none of these types would have suited Montague. His genius may be compared to that pinion which, though it is too weak to lift the ostrich into the air, enables her, while she remains on the earth, to outrun hound, horse, and dromedary. If the man who possesses this kind of genius attempts to ascend the heaven of invention, his awkwardness and unsuccessful efforts expose him to derision. But if he will be content to stay in the terrestrial region of business, he will find that the faculties which would not enable him to soar into a higher sphere will enable him to distance all his competitors in the lower. As a poet, Montague could never have risen above the crowd. But in the House of Commons, now fast becoming supreme in the state, and extending its control over one executive department after another, the young adventurer soon obtained a place very different from the place which he occupies among men of letters. At 30, he would gladly have given all his chances in life for a comfortable vicarage and a chaplain's scarf. At 37, he was First Lord of the Treasury, Chancellor of the Exchequer, and a Regent of the kingdom, and this elevation he owed not at all to favour, but solely to the unquestionable superiority of his talents for administration and debate. End of section 7. Section 8 of Chapter 20 of A History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay. Chapter 20, Section 8. The extraordinary ability with which, at the beginning of the year 1692, he managed the conference on the bill for regulating trials in cases of treason, placed him at once in the first rank of parliamentary orators. On that occasion he was opposed to a crowd of veteran senators renowned for their eloquence. Halifax, Rochester, Nottingham, Mulgrave, and proved himself a match for them all. He was speedily seated at the Board of Treasury, and there the clear-headed and experienced Godolphin soon found that his young colleague was his master. When Somers had quitted the House of Commons, Montague had no rival there. Sir Thomas Littleton, once distinguished as the ablest debater and man of business among the Whig members, was content to serve under his junior. To this day we may discern in many parts of our financial and commercial system the marks of the vigorous intellect and daring spirit of Montague. His bitterest enemies were unable to deny that some of the expedients which he had proposed had proved highly beneficial to the nation. But it was said that these expedients were not devised by himself. He was represented in 100 pamphlets as the daw in borrowed plumes. He had taken, it was affirmed, the hint of every one of his great plans from the writings or the conversation of some ingenious speculator. This reproach was, in truth, no reproach. We can scarcely expect to find in the same human being the talents which are necessary for the making of new discoveries in political science, and the talents which obtain the assent of divided and tumultuous assemblies to great practical reforms. To be at once an Adam Smith and a Pitt is scarcely possible. It is surely praise enough for a busy politician that he knows how to use the theories of others, that he discerns among the schemes of innumerable projectors the precise scheme which is wanted and which is practicable, that he shapes it to suit pressing circumstances and popular humours, that he proposes it just when it is most likely to be favourably received, that he triumphantly defends it against all objectors, and that he carries it into execution with prudence and energy. And to this praise no English statesman has a fairer claim than Montague. It is a remarkable proof of his self-knowledge that from the moment at which he began to distinguish himself in public life, he ceased to be a versifier. It does not appear that after he became a Lord of the Treasury he ever wrote a couplet, with the exception of a few well-turned lines inscribed on a set of toasting glasses which were sacred to the most renowned Whig beauties of his time. He wisely determined to derive from the poetry of others a glory which he never would have derived from his own. As a patron of genius and learning, he ranks with his two illustrious friends, Dorset and Somers. His munificence fully equalled theirs, and though he was inferior to them in delicacy of taste, he succeeded in associating his name inseparably with some names which will last as long as our language. Yet it must be acknowledged that Montague, with admirable parts and with many claims on the gratitude of his country, had great faults, and unhappily faults not of the noblest kind. His head was not strong enough to bear without giddiness the speed of his ascent and the height of his position. He became offensively arrogant and vain. He was too often cold to his old friends, and ostentatious in displaying his new riches. Above all, he was insatiably greedy of praise, and liked it best when it was of the coarsest and rankest quality. But in 1693 these faults were less offensive than they became a few years later. With Russell's, Somers, and Montague was closely connected during a quarter of a century a fourth Whig, who in character bore little resemblance to any of them. This was Thomas Wharton, eldest son of Philip, Lord Wharton. Thomas Wharton has been repeatedly mentioned in the course of this narrative, but it is now time to describe him more fully. He was in his 47th year, but was still a young man in constitution, in appearance, and in manners. Those who hated him most heartily, and no man was hated more heartily, admitted that his natural parts were excellent, and that he was equally qualified for debate and for action. The history of his mind deserves notice, for it was the history of many thousands of minds. His rank and abilities made him so conspicuous that in him we are able to trace distinctly the origin and progress of a moral taint which was epidemic among his contemporaries. He was born in the days of the Covenant, and was the heir of a covenanted house. His father was renowned as a distributor of Calvinistic tracts and a patron of Calvinistic divines. The boy's first years were passed amidst Geneva bands, heads of lank hair, upturned eyes, nasal psalmody, and sermons 3 hours long. Plays and poems, hunting and dancing, were proscribed by the austere discipline of his saintly family. The fruits of this education became visible when, from the sullen mansion of Puritan parents, the hot-blooded, quick-witted young patrician emerged into the gay and voluptuous London of the Restoration. The most dissolute cavaliers stood aghast at the dissoluteness of the emancipated precisian. He early acquired and retained to the last the reputation of being the greatest rake in England. Of wine, indeed, he never became the slave, and he used it chiefly for the purpose of making himself the master of his associates. But to the end of his long life, the wives and daughters of his nearest friends were not safe from his licentious plots. The ribaldry of his conversation moved astonishment even in that age. To the religion of his country he offered, in the mere wantonness of impiety, insults too foul to be described. His mendacity and his effrontery passed into proverbs. Of all the liars of his time, he was the most deliberate, the most inventive, and the most circumstantial. What shame meant, he did not seem to understand. No reproaches, even when pointed and barbed with the sharpest wit, appeared to give him pain. Great satirists, animated by a deadly personal aversion, exhausted all their strength in attacks upon him. They assailed him with keen invective. They assailed him with still keener irony. But they found that neither invective nor irony could move him to anything but an unforced smile and a good-humoured curse, and they at length threw down the lash, acknowledging that it was impossible to make him feel. That, with such vices, he should have played a great part in life, should have carried numerous elections against the most formidable opposition by his personal popularity, should have had such a large following in Parliament, should have risen to the highest offices of the state, seems extraordinary. But he lived in times when faction was almost a madness, and he possessed in an eminent degree the qualities of the leader of a faction. There was a single tie which he respected. The falsest of mankind in all relations but one, he was the truest of Whigs. The religious tenets of his family he had early renounced with contempt, but to the politics of his family he steadfastly adhered through all the temptations and danger of half a century. In small things and in great, his devotion to his party constantly appeared. He had the finest stud in England, and his delight was to win plates from Tories. Sometimes when, in a distant county, it was fully expected that the horse of a high church squire would be first on the course, down came, on the very eve of the race, Wharton's Careless, who had ceased to run at Newmarket merely for the want of competitors, or Wharton's Gelding, for whom Louis XIV had in vain offered 1,000 pistoles. A man whose mere sport was of this description was not likely to be easily beaten in any serious contest. Such a master of the whole art of electioneering England had never seen. Buckinghamshire was his own especial province, and there he ruled without a rival. but he extended his care over the Whig interest in Yorkshire, Cumberland, Westmoreland, Wiltshire. Sometimes 20, sometimes 30 members of Parliament were named by him. As a canvasser he was irresistible. He never forgot a face that he had once seen. Nay, in the towns in which he wished to establish an interest, he remembered not only the voters but their families. His opponents were confounded by the strength of his memory and the affability of his deportment, and owned that it was impossible to contend against a great man who called the shoemaker by his Christian name, who was sure that the butcher's daughter must be growing a fine girl, and who was anxious to know whether the blacksmith's youngest boy was breeched. By such arts as these he made himself so popular that his journeys to the Buckinghamshire quarter sessions resembled royal progresses. The bells of every parish through which he passed were rung, and flowers were strewed along the road. It was commonly believed that in the course of his life he expended on his parliamentary interest not less than £80,000, a sum which, when compared with the value of estates, must be considered as equivalent to more than £300,000 in our time. But the chief service which Wharton rendered to the Whig party was that of bringing in recruits from the young aristocracy. He was quite as dexterous a canvasser among the embroidered coats at the St. James's coffee-houses as among the leathern aprons at Wickham and Aylesbury. He had his eye on every boy of quality who came of age, and it was not easy for such a boy to resist the arts of a noble, eloquent, and wealthy flatterer, who united juvenile vivacity to profound art and long experience of the gay world. It mattered not what the novice preferred, gallantry or field sports, the dice box or the bottle. Wharton soon found out the master passion, offered sympathy, advice, and assistance, and, while seeming to be only the minister of his disciples' pleasure, made sure of his disciples' vote. The party to whose interests Wharton, with such spirit and constancy, devoted his time, his fortune, his talents, his very vices, judged him, as was natural, far too leniently. He was widely known by the very undeserved appellation of Honest Tom. Some pious men, Burnet, for example, and Addison, averted their eyes from the scandal which he gave, and spoke of him not with esteem, yet with goodwill. A most ingenious and accomplished Whig, the third Earl of Shaftesbury, author of the Characteristics, described Wharton as the most mysterious of human beings, as a strange compound of best and worst, of private depravity and public virtue, and owned himself unable to understand how a man utterly without principle in everything but politics should, in politics, be as true as steel. But that which, in the judgment of one faction, more than half redeemed all Wharton's faults, seemed to the other faction to aggravate them all. The opinion which the Tories entertained of him is expressed in a single line written after his death by the ablest man of that party. He was the most universal villain that I ever knew. Wharton's political adversaries thirsted for his blood, and repeatedly tried to shed it. Had he not been a man of imperturbable temper, dauntless courage, and consummate skill in fence, his life would have been a short one. But neither anger nor danger ever deprived him of his presence of mind. He was an incomparable swordsman, and he had a peculiar way of disarming opponents which moved the envy of all the duellists of his time. His friends said that he had never given a challenge, that he had never refused one, that he had never taken a life, and yet that he had never fought without having his antagonist's life at his mercy. The four men who have been described resembled each other so little that it may be thought strange that they should ever have been able to act in concert. They did, however, act in the closest concert during many years. They more than once rose and more than once fell together, but their union lasted till it was dissolved by death. Little as some of them may have deserved esteem, none of them can be accused of having been false to his brethren of the junto. While the great body of the Whigs was, under these able chiefs, arraying itself in order resembling that of a regular army, the Tories were in a state of an ill-drilled and ill-officered militia. They were numerous and they were zealous, but they can hardly be said to have had at this time any chief in the House of Commons. The name of Seymour had once been great among them, and had not quite lost its influence. But since he had been at the Board of Treasury, he had disgusted them by vehemently defending all that he had himself, when out of place, vehemently attacked. They had once looked up to the Speaker, Trevor, but his greediness, impudence and venality were now so notorious that all respectable gentlemen of all shades of opinion were ashamed to see him in the chair. Of the old Tory members, Sir Christopher Musgrave alone had much weight. Indeed, the real leaders of the party were 2 or 3 men bred in principles diametrically opposed to Toryism, men who had carried Whiggism to the verge of republicanism, and who had been considered not merely as low churchmen, but as more than half Presbyterians. Of these men, the most eminent were the 2 great Herefordshire squires, Robert Harley and Paul Foley. The space which Robert Harley fills in the history of 3 reigns, his elevation, his fall, the influence which, at a great crisis, he exercised on the politics of all Europe, the close intimacy in which he lived with some of the greatest wits and poets of his time, and the frequent recurrence of his name in the works of Swift, Pope, Arbuthnot and Prior, must always make him an object of interest. Yet the man himself was of all men the least interesting. There is indeed a whimsical contrast between the very ordinary qualities of his mind and the very extraordinary vicissitudes of his fortune. He was the heir of a Puritan family. His father, Sir Edward Harley, had been conspicuous among the patriots of the Long Parliament, had commanded a regiment under Essex, had, after the Restoration, been an active opponent of the court, had supported the Exclusion Bill, had harboured dissenting preachers, had frequented meeting-houses, and had made himself so obnoxious to the ruling powers that at the time of the Western insurrection he had been placed under arrest, and his house had been searched for arms. When the Dutch army was marching from Torbay towards London, he and his eldest son Robert declared for the Prince of Orange and a free Parliament, raised a large body of horse, took possession of Worcester, and evinced their zeal against Popery by publicly breaking to pieces in the High Street of that city a piece of sculpture which to rigid precisians seemed idolatrous. Soon after the Convention became a Parliament, Robert Harley was sent up to Westminster as member for a Cornish borough. His conduct was such as might have been expected from his birth and education. He was a Whig, and indeed an intolerant and vindictive Whig. Nothing would satisfy him but a general proscription of the Tories. His name appears in the list of those members who voted for the Sacheverell clause, and at the general election which took place in the spring of 1690, the party which he had persecuted made great exertions to keep him out of the House of Commons. A cry was raised that the Harleys were mortal enemies of the Church, and this cry produced so much effect that it was with difficulty that any of them could obtain a seat. Such was the commencement of the public life of a man whose name, a quarter of a century later, was inseparably coupled with the High Church in the acclamations of Jacobite mobs. Soon, however, it began to be observed that in every division Harley was in the company of those gentlemen who held his political opinions in abhorrence. Nor was this strange, for he affected the character of a Whig of the old pattern, and before the Revolution it had always been supposed that a Whig was a person who watched with jealousy every exertion of the prerogative, who was slow to loose the strings of the public purse, and who was extreme to mark the faults of the ministers of the Crown. Such a Whig Harley still professed to be. He did not admit that the recent change of dynasty had made any change in the duties of a representative of the people. The new government ought to be observed as suspiciously, checked as severely, and supplied as sparingly as the old one. Acting on these principles, he necessarily found himself acting with men on whose principles were diametrically opposed to his. He liked to thwart the king. They liked to thwart the usurper. The consequence was that, whenever there was an opportunity of thwarting William, the Roundhead stayed in the house or went into the lobby in company with the whole crowd of Cavaliers. Soon Harley acquired the authority of a leader among those with whom, notwithstanding wide differences of opinion, he ordinarily voted. His influence in Parliament was indeed altogether out of proportion to his abilities. His intellect was both small and slow. He was unable to take a large view of any subject. He never acquired the art of expressing himself in public with fluency and perspicuity. To the end of his life he remained a tedious, hesitating, and confused speaker. End of section 8.
Of Chapter 20 of A History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bill McGovern. History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay. Chapter 20. He had none of the external graces of an orator. His countenance was heavy, his figure mean and somewhat deformed, and his gestures uncouth. Yet he was heard with respect, for, such as his mind was, it had been assiduously cultivated. His youth had been studious, and to the last he continued to love books and the society of men of genius and learning. Indeed, he aspired to the character of a wit and a poet, and occasionally employed hours which should have been very differently spent in composing verses more execrable than the bellman's. His time, however, was not always so absurdly wasted. He had that sort of industry and that sort of exactness which would have made him a respectable antiquary or king at arms. His taste led him to plod among old records, and in that age It was only by plodding among old records that any man could obtain an accurate and extensive knowledge of the law of Parliament. Having few rivals in this laborious and unattractive pursuit, he soon began to be regarded as an oracle on questions of form and privilege. His moral character added not a little to his influence. He had indeed great vices, but they were not of a scandalous kind. He was not to be corrupted by money. His private life was regular. No illicit amour was imputed to him even by satirists. Gambling he held in aversion, and it was said that he never passed White's, then the favourite haunt of noble sharpers and dupes, without an exclamation of anger. His practice of flustering himself daily with claret was hardly considered as a fault by his contemporaries. His knowledge, his gravity, and his independent position gained for him the ear of the House, and even his bad speaking was, in some sense, an advantage to him. For people are very loath to admit that the same man can unite very different kinds of excellence. It is soothing to envy to believe that what is splendid cannot be solid, that what is clear cannot be profound. Very slowly was the public brought to acknowledge that Mansfield was a great jurist, and that Burke was a great master of political science. Montague was a brilliant rhetorician, and therefore, though he had 10 times Harley's capacity for the driest parts of business, was represented by detractors as a superficial, prating pretender. But from the absence of show in Harley's discourses, many people inferred that there must be much substance, and he was pronounced to be a deep-read, deep-thinking gentleman, not a fine talker, but fitter to direct affairs of state than all the fine talkers in the world. This character he long supported with that cunning which is frequently found in company with ambitious and unquiet mediocrity. He constantly had, even with his best friends, an air of mystery and reserve, which seemed to indicate that he knew some momentous secret, and that his mind was labouring with some vast design. In this way he got, and long kept, a high reputation for wisdom. It was not till that reputation had made him an Earl, a Knight of the Garter, Lord High Treasurer of England, and Master of the Fate of Europe, that his admirers began to find out that he was really a dull, puzzle-headed man. Soon after the general election of 1690, Harley, generally voting with the Tories, began to turn Tory. The change was so gradual as to be almost imperceptible, but was not the less real. He early began to hold the Tory doctrine that England ought to confine herself to a maritime war. He early felt the true Tory antipathy to Dutchmen and to moneyed men. The antipathy to dissenters, which was necessary to the completeness of the character, came much later. At length the transformation was complete, and the old haunter of conventicles became an intolerant high churchman. Yet to the last the traces of his early breeding would now and then show themselves, and, while he acted after the fashion of Laud, he sometimes wrote in the style of Praise God Barebones. Of Paul Foley we know comparatively little. His history up to a certain point greatly resembles that of Harley, but he appears to have been superior to Harley both in parts and in elevation of character. He was the son of Thomas Foley, a new man, but a man of great merit, who, having begun life with nothing, had created a noble estate by ironworks, and who was renowned for his spotless integrity and his munificent charity. The Foleys were, like their neighbours the Harleys, Whigs and Puritans. Thomas Foley lived on terms of close intimacy with Baxter, in whose writings he is mentioned with warm eulogy. The opinions and the attachments of Paul Foley were at first those of his family, but he, like Harley, became, merely from the vehemence of his Whiggism, an ally of the Tories, and might perhaps, like Harley, have been completely metamorphosed into a Tory, if the process of transmutation had not been interrupted by death. Foley's abilities were highly respectable, and had been improved by education. He was so wealthy that it was unnecessary for him to follow the law as a profession, but he had studied it carefully as a science. His morals were without stain, and the greatest fault which could be imputed to him was that he paraded his independence and disinterestedness too ostentatiously, and was so much afraid of being thought to fawn that he was always growling. Another convert ought to be mentioned. Howe, lately the most virulent of the Whigs, had been, by the loss of his place, turned into one of the most virulent of the Tories. The deserter brought to the party which he had joined no weight of character, no capacity or semblance of capacity for great affairs, but much parliamentary ability of a low kind, much spite and much impudence. No speaker of that time seems to have had in such large measure both the power and inclination to give pain. The assistance of these men was most welcome to the Tory party, but it was impossible that they could, as yet, exercise over that party the entire authority of the leaders, for they still called themselves Whigs, and generally vindicated their Tory votes by arguments grounded on Whig principles. From this view of the state of parties in the House of Commons, it seems clear that Sunderland had good reason for recommending that the administration should be entrusted to the Whigs. The King, however, hesitated long before he could bring himself to quit that neutral position which he had long occupied between the contending parties. If one of those parties was disposed to question his title, the other was on principle hostile to his prerogative. He still remembered with bitterness the unreasonable and vindictive conduct of the Convention Parliament at the close of 1689 and the beginning of 1690. He shrank from the thought of being entirely in the hands of men who had obstructed the bill of indemnity, who had voted for the Sacheverell clause, and who had tried to prevent him from taking the command of his army in Ireland, and who had called him an ungrateful tyrant merely because he would not be their slave and their hangman. He had once, by a bold and unexpected effort, freed himself from their yoke, and he was not inclined to put it on his neck again. He personally disliked Wharton and Russell. He thought highly of the capacity of Caermarthen, of the integrity of Nottingham, of the diligence and financial skill of Godolphin. It was only by slow degrees that the arguments of Sunderland, backed by the force of circumstances, overcame all objections. On the 7th of November 1693 the Parliament met, and the conflict of parties instantly began. William from the throne pressed on the Houses the necessity of making a great exertion to arrest the progress of France on the Continent. During the last campaign, he said, she had on every point had a superiority of force, and it had therefore been found impossible to cope with her. His allies had promised to increase their armies, and he trusted that the Commons would enable him to do the same. The Commons at their next sitting took the King's speech into consideration. The miscarriage of the Smyrna fleet was the chief subject of discussion. The cry for inquiry was universal, but it was evident that the two parties raised that cry for very different reasons. Montague spoke the sense of the Whigs. He had declared that the disasters of the summer could not, in his opinion, be explained by the ignorance and imbecility of those who had charge of the naval administration. There must have been treason. It was impossible to believe that Lewis, when he sent his Brest squadron to the Straits of Gibraltar, and left the whole coast of his kingdom, from Dunkirk to Bayonne, unprotected, had trusted merely to chance. He must have been well assured that his fleet would meet with a vast booty under a feeble convoy. As there had been treachery in some quarters, there had been incapacity in others. The state was ill served. And then the orator pronounced a warm panegyric on his friend Somers. Would that all men in power would follow the example of my Lord Keeper. If all patronage were bestowed as judiciously and disinterestedly as his, we should not see the public offices filled with men who draw salaries and perform no duties. It was moved and carried unanimously that the Commons would support their Majesties, and would forthwith proceed to investigate the cause of the disaster of the Bay of Lagos. The Lords of the Admiralty were directed to produce a great mass of documentary evidence. The King sent down copies of the examinations taken before the Committee of Council, which Mary had appointed to inquire into the grievances of the Turkey merchants. The Turkey merchants themselves were called in and interrogated. Rooke, though too ill to stand or speak, was brought in a chair to the bar, and there delivered a narrative of his proceedings. The Whigs soon thought that sufficient ground had been laid for a vote condemning the naval administration, and moved a resolution attributing the miscarriage of the Smyrna fleet to notorious and treacherous mismanagement. That there had been mismanagement could not be disputed, but that there had been foul play had certainly not been proved. The Tories proposed that the word treacherous should be omitted. A division took place, and the Whigs carried their point by 140 votes to 103. Wharton was a teller for the majority. It was now decided that there had been treason, but not who was the traitor. Several keen debates followed. The Whigs tried to throw the blame on Killigrew and Delaval, who were Tories. The Tories did their best to make out that the fault lay with the victualling department, which was under the direction of Whigs. But the House of Commons has always been much more ready to pass votes of censure drawn in general terms than to brand individuals by name. A resolution clearing the victualling office was proposed by Montague, and carried, after a debate of 2 days, by 188 votes to 152. But when the victorious party brought forward a motion inculpating the admirals, the Tories came up in great numbers from the country, and after a debate which lasted from 9 in the morning till near 11 at night, succeeded in saving their friends. The noes were 170, and the ayes only 161. Another attack was made a few days later with no better success. The noes were 185, the ayes only 175. The indefatigable and implacable Wharton was on both occasions teller for the minority. In spite of this check, the advantage was decidedly with the Whigs. The Tories, who were at the head of the naval administration, had indeed escaped impeachment, but the escape had been so narrow that it was impossible for the King to employ them any longer. The advice of Sunderland prevailed. A new Commission of Admiralty was prepared, and Russell was named First Lord. He had already been appointed to command of the Channel fleet. His elevation made it necessary that Nottingham should retire, for, though it was not then unusual to see men who were personally and politically hostile to each other holding high offices at the same time, the relation between the First Lord of the Admiralty and the Secretary of State, who had charge of what would now be called the War Department, was of so peculiar a nature that the public service could not well be conducted without cordial cooperation between them. And between Nottingham and Russell such cooperation was not to be expected. "I thank you," William said to Nottingham, "for your services. I have nothing to complain of in your conduct. It is only from necessity that I part with you." Nottingham retired with dignity. Though a very honest man, he went out of office much richer than he had come in 5 years before. What were then considered as the legitimate emoluments of his place were great. He had sold Kensington House to the Crown for a large sum, and he had probably, after the fashion of that time, obtained for himself some lucrative grants. He laid out all his gains in purchasing land. He heard, he said, that his enemies meant to accuse him of having acquired wealth by illicit means. He was perfectly ready to abide the issue of an inquiry. He would not, as some ministers had done, place his fortune beyond the reach of the justice of his country. He would have no secret hoard. He would invest nothing in foreign funds. His property should all be such as could be readily discovered and seized. During some weeks the seals which Nottingham had delivered up remained in the royal closet. To dispose of them proved no easy matter. They were offered to Shrewsbury, who of all the Whig leaders stood highest in the King's favour. But Shrewsbury excused himself, and, in order to avoid further importunity, retired into the country. There he soon received a pressing letter from Elizabeth Villiers. This lady had, when a girl, inspired William with a passion which had caused much scandal and much unhappiness in the little court of the Hague. Her influence over him she owed not to her personal charms, for it tasked all the art of Kneller to make her look tolerably on canvas, not to those talents which peculiarly belonged to her sex, for she did not excel in playful talk, and her letters are remarkably deficient in feminine ease and grace, but to powers of mind which qualified her to partake the cares and guide the counsels of statesmen. To the end of her life, great politicians sought her advice. Even Swift, the shrewdest and most cynical of her contemporaries, pronounced her the wisest of women, and more than once sat, fascinated by her conversation, from 2 in the afternoon till near midnight. By degrees the virtues and charms of Mary conquered the first place in her husband's affection. But he still, in difficult conjunctures, frequently applied to Elizabeth Villiers for advice and assistance. She now implored Shrewsbury to reconsider his determination, and not to throw away the opportunity of uniting the Whig party for ever. Wharton and Russell wrote to the same effect. In reply came flimsy and unmeaning excuses. I am not qualified for a court life. I am unequal to a place which requires much exertion. I do not quite agree with any party in the state. In short, I am unfit for the world. I want to travel. I want to see Spain. These were mere pretences. Had Shrewsbury spoken the whole truth, he would have said that he had, in an evil hour, been false to the cause of that revolution in which he had borne so great a part, and that he had entered into engagements of which he repented, but of which he knew not how to extricate himself, and that, while he remained under those engagements, he was unwilling to enter into the service of the existing government. Marlborough, Godolphin and Russell, indeed, had no scruple about corresponding with one king while holding office under the other. But Shrewsbury had, what was wanting in Marlborough, Godolphin and Russell, a conscience which indeed too often failed to restrain him from doing wrong, but which never failed to punish him. In consequence of his refusal to accept the seals, the ministerial arrangements which the King had planned were not carried into entire effect till the end of the session. Meanwhile the proceedings of the two Houses had been highly interesting and important. Soon after the Parliament met, the attention of the Commons was again called to the state of the trade with India, and the charter which had just been granted to the old company was laid before them. They would probably have been disposed to sanction the new arrangement, which in truth differed little from that which they had themselves suggested not many months before, if the directors had acted with prudence. But the directors, from the day on which they had obtained their charter, had persecuted the interlopers without mercy, and had quite forgotten that it was one thing to persecute interlopers on the eastern seas, and another to persecute them in the port of London. Hitherto the war of the monopolists against the private trade had been generally carried on at a distance of 15,000 miles from England. If harsh things were done, the English did not see them done, and did not hear of them till long after they had been done. Nor was it by any means easy to ascertain at Westminster who had been right and who had been wrong in a dispute which had arisen 3 or 4 years before at Moorshedabad or Canton. With incredible rashness, the directors determined, at the very moment when the fate of the company was in the balance, to give the people of this country a near view of the most odious features of the monopoly. Some wealthy merchants of London had equipped a fine ship named the Redbridge. Her crew was numerous, her cargo of immense value. Her papers had been made out for Alicant, but there was some reason to suspect that she was really bound for the countries lying beyond the Cape of Good Hope. She was stopped by the Admiralty in obedience to an order which the Company obtained from the Privy Council, doubtless by the help of the Lord President. Every day that she lay at the Thames caused a heavy expense to the owners. The indignation in the city was great and general. The Company maintained that from the legality of the monopoly, the legality of the detention necessarily followed. The public turned the argument around, and being firmly convinced that the detention was illegal, drew the inference that the monopoly must be illegal too. The dispute was at the height when the Parliament met. Petitions on both sides were speedily laid on the table of the Commons, and it was resolved that these petitions should be taken into consideration by a committee of the whole House. The first question on which the conflicting parties tried their strength was the choice of a chairman. The enemies of the old Company proposed Papillon, once the closest ally and subsequently the keenest opponent of Child, and carried their point by 138 votes to 106. The committee proceeded to inquire by what authority the Redbridge had been stopped. One of her owners, Gilbert Heathcote, a rich merchant and a staunch Whig, appeared at the bar as a witness. He was asked whether he would venture to deny that the ship had really been fitted out for the Indian trade. "It is no sin that I know of," he answered, "to trade with India, and I shall trade with India till I am restrained by an Act of Parliament." Papillon reported that in the opinion of the committee the detention of the Redbridge was illegal. The question was then put that the House would agree with the committee. The friends of the old Company ventured on a second division and were defeated by 171 votes to 125. End of section 9.
End of chapter 20 of A History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay. Chapter 20, Section 10. The blow was quickly followed up. A few days later it was moved that all subjects of England had equal right to trade to the East Indies unless prohibited by Act of Parliament, and the supporters of the old Company, sensible that they were in a minority, suffered the motion to pass without a division. This memorial vote settled the most important of the constitutional questions which had been left unsettled by the Bill of Rights. It has ever since been held to be the sound doctrine that no power but that of the whole legislature can give to any person or to any society an exclusive privilege of trading to any part of the world. The opinion of the great majority of the House of Commons was that the Indian trade could be advantageously carried on only by means of a joint stock and a monopoly. It might therefore have been expected that the resolution which destroyed the monopoly of the old Company would have been immediately followed by a law granting a monopoly to the new Company. No such law, however, was passed. The old Company, though not strong enough to defend its own privileges, was able, with the help of its Tory friends, to prevent the rival association from obtaining similar privileges. The consequence was that, during some years, there was nominally a free trade with India. In fact, the trade still lay under severe restrictions. The private adventurer found indeed no difficulty in sailing from England, but his situation was as perilous as ever when he had turned the Cape of Good Hope. Whatever respect might be paid to a vote of the House of Commons by public functionaries in London, such a vote was, at Bombay or Calcutta, much less regarded than a private letter from Child, and Child still continued to fight the battle with unbroken spirit. He sent out to the factories of the companies orders that no indulgence should be shown to the intruders. For the House of Commons and for its resolutions he expressed the bitterest contempt. "Be guided by my instructions," he wrote, "and not by the nonsense of a few ignorant country gentlemen who have hardly wit enough to manage their own private affairs, and who know nothing at all about questions of trade." It appears that his directions were obeyed. Everywhere in the East, during this period of anarchy, servant of the company and the independent merchant waged war on each other, accused each other of piracy, and tried by every artifice to exasperate the Mogul government against each other. The three great constitutional questions of the preceding year were, in this year, again brought under the consideration of Parliament. In the first week of the session, a bill for the regulation of trials in cases of high treason, a triennial bill, and a place bill were laid on the table of the House of Commons. None of these bills became a law. The first passed the Commons, but was unfavourably received by the Peers. William took so much interest in the question that he came down to the House of Lords, not in his crown and robes, but in the ordinary dress of a gentleman, and sat through the whole debate on the second reading. Caermarthen spoke of the dangers to which the state was at that time exposed, and entreated his brethren not to give, at such a moment, impunity to traitors. He was powerfully supported by two eminent orators, who had, during some years, been on the uncourtly side of every question, but who in this session showed a disposition to strengthen the hands of the government, Halifax and Mulgrave. Marlborough, Rochester, and Nottingham spoke for the bill, but the general feeling was so clearly against them that they did not venture to divide. It is probable, however, that the reasons urged by Caermarthen were not the reasons which chiefly swayed his hearers. The Peers were fully determined that the bill should not pass without a clause altering the constitution of the court of the Lord High Steward. They knew that the Lower House was as fully determined not to pass such a clause, and they thought it better that what must happen at last should happen speedily and without a quarrel. The fate of the triennial bill confounded all the calculations of the best informed politicians of that time, and may therefore well seem extraordinary to us. During the recess, that bill had been described in numerous pamphlets, written for the most part by persons zealous for the Revolution and for popular principles of government, as the one thing needful, as the universal cure for the distempers of the state. On the first, second, and third readings in the House of Commons no division took place. The Whigs were enthusiastic. The Tories seemed to be acquiescent. It was understood that the King, though he had used his veto for the purpose of giving the Houses an opportunity of reconsidering the subject, had no intention of offering a pertinacious opposition to their wishes. But Seymour, with a cunning which long experience had matured, after deferring the conflict to the last moment, snatched the victory from his adversaries when they were most secure. When the Speaker held up the bill in his hands, and put the question whether it should pass, the noes were 146, the ayes only 136. Some eager Whigs flattered themselves that their defeat was the effect of a surprise, and might be retrieved. Within 3 days, therefore, Monmouth, the most ardent and restless man in the whole party, brought into the Upper House a bill substantially the same with that which had so strangely miscarried in the Lower. The Peers passed this bill very expeditiously, and sent it down to the Commons. But in the Commons it found no favour. Many members, who professed to wish that the duration of Parliaments should be limited, resented the interference of the hereditary branch of the legislature in a matter which peculiarly concerned the elective branch. The subject, they said, is one which especially belongs to us. We have considered it, we have come to a decision, and it is scarcely parliamentary. It is certainly most indelicate in their lordships to call upon us to reverse that decision. The question now is, not whether the duration of Parliaments ought to be limited, but whether we ought to submit our judgment to the authority of the Peers, and to rescind, at their bidding, what we did only a fortnight ago. The animosity with which the patrician order was regarded was inflamed by the arts and the eloquence of Seymour. The bill contained a definition of the words "to hold a Parliament." This definition was scrutinized with extreme jealousy, and was thought by many, with very little reason, to have been framed for the purpose of extending the privileges, already invidiously great, of the nobility. It appears from the scanty and obscure fragments of the debates which have come down to us, that bitter reflections were thrown on the general conduct, both political and judicial, of the peers. Old Titus, though zealous for triennial parliaments, owned that he was not surprised at the ill humour which many gentlemen showed. "It is true," he said, "that we ought to be dissolved, but it is rather hard, I must own, that the Lords are to prescribe the time of our dissolution. The Apostle Paul wished to be dissolved, but, I doubt, if his friends had set him a day, he would not have taken it kindly of them." The bill was rejected by 197 votes to 127. The Place Bill, differing very little from the Place Bill which had been brought in 12 months before, passed easily through the Commons. Most of the Tories supported it warmly, and the Whigs did not venture to oppose it. It went up to the Lords, and soon came back completely changed. As it had been originally drawn, it provided that no member of the House of Commons, elected after the 1st of January, 1694, should accept any place of profit under the Crown, on pain of forfeiting his seat, and of being incapable of sitting again in the same Parliament. The Lords had added the words, "unless he be afterwards again chosen to serve in the same Parliament." These words, few as they were, sufficed to deprive the bill of 9/10 of its efficacy, both for the good and for the evil. It was most desirable that the crowd of subordinate public functionaries should be kept out of the House of Commons. It was most undesirable that the heads of the great executive departments should be kept out of that House. The bill, as altered, left that House open both to those who ought and to those who ought not have been admitted. It very properly let in the Secretaries of State and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, but it let in with them commissioners of wine licenses and commissioners of the Navy, receivers, surveyors, storekeepers, clerks of the Acts and clerks of the Check, clerks of the Green Cloth and clerks of the Great Wardrobe. So little did the Commons understand what they were about that, after framing a law, in one view most mischievous, and in another view most beneficial, they were perfectly willing that it should be transformed into a law quite harmless and almost useless. They agreed to the amendment, and nothing was now wanting but the royal sanction. The sanction certainly ought not to have been withheld, and probably would not have been withheld, if William had known how unimportant the bill now was. But he understood the question as little as the Commons themselves. He knew that they imagined that they had devised a most stringent limitation of the royal power, and he was determined not to submit, without a struggle, to any such limitation. He was encouraged by the success with which he had hitherto resisted the attempts of the two Houses to encroach on his prerogative. He had refused to pass the bill which quartered the judges on his hereditary revenue, and the Parliament had silently acquiesced in the justice of the refusal. He had refused to pass the triennial bill, and the Commons had since, by rejecting 2 triennial bills, acknowledged that he had done well. He ought, however, to have considered that, on both these occasions, the announcement of his refusal was immediately followed by the announcement that the Parliament was prorogued. On both these occasions, therefore, the members had half a year to think and to grow cool before the next sitting. The case was now very different. The principal business of the session was hardly begun. Estimates were still under consideration. Bills of supply were still depending, and, if the Houses should take a fit of ill humour, the consequences might be serious indeed. He resolved, however, to run the risk. Whether he had any adviser is not known. His determination seems to have taken both the leading Whigs and the leading Tories by surprise. When the clerk had proclaimed that the King and Queen would consider of the bill touching free and impartial proceedings in Parliament, the Commons retired from the bar of the Lords in a resentful and ungovernable mood. As soon as the Speaker was again in his chair, There was a long and tempestuous debate. All other business was postponed. All committees were adjourned. It was resolved that the House would, early the next morning, take into consideration the state of the nation. When the morning came, the excitement did not appear to have abated. The mace was sent to Westminster Hall and in the Court of Requests. All members who could be found were brought into the House. That none might be able to steal away unnoticed, the back door was locked and the key laid on the table. All strangers were ordered to retire. With these solemn preparations began a sitting which reminded a few old men of some of the first sittings of the Kong Parliament. High words were uttered by the enemies of the government. Its friends, afraid of being accused of abandoning the cause of the Commons of England for the sake of the royal favour, hardly ventured to raise their voices. Montague alone seemed to have defended the king. Lowther, though high in office and a member of the cabinet, owned that there were evil influences at work, and expressed a wish to see the sovereign surrounded by counsellors in whom the representatives of the people could confide. Harley, Foley, and Howe carried everything before them. A resolution affirming that those who had advised the crown on this occasion were public enemies was carried with only 2 or 3 noes. Harley, after reminding his hearers that they had their negative voice as the king had his, and that, if his majesty refused them redress, they could refuse him money, moved that they should go up to the throne, not, as usual, with a humble address, but with a representation. Some members proposed to substitute the more respectful word address, but they were overruled, and a committee was appointed to draw up the representation. Another night passed, and when the House met again, it appeared that the storm had greatly subsided. The malignant joy and the wild hopes which the Jacobites had, during the last 48 hours, expressed with their usual imprudence, had incensed and alarmed the Whigs and the moderate Tories. Many members, too, were frightened by hearing that William was fully determined not to yield without an appeal to the nation. Such an appeal might have been successful, for a dissolution, on any ground whatever, would, at that moment, have been a highly popular exercise of the prerogative. The constituent bodies, it was well known, were generally zealous for the Triennial Bill, and cared comparatively little about the Place Bill. Many Tory members, therefore, who had recently voted against the Triennial Bill, were by no means desirous to run the risks of a general election. When the representation which Harley and his friends had prepared was read, it was thought offensively strong. After being recommitted, shortened, and softened, it was presented by the whole House. William's answer was kind and gentle, but he conceded nothing. He assured the Commons that he remembered with gratitude the support which he had on many occasions received from them, and he should always consider their advice as most valuable, and that he should look on counsellors who might attempt to raise dissension between him and his Parliament as his enemies, but he uttered not a word which could be construed into an acknowledgment that he had used his veto ill, or into a promise that he would not use it again. The Commons on the morrow took his speech into consideration. Harley and his allies complained that the king's answer was no answer at all, threatened to tack the Place Bill to a money bill, and proposed to make a second representation pressing his Majesty to explain himself more distinctly. But by this time there was a strong reflux of feeling in the Assembly. The Whigs had not only recovered from their dismay, but were in high spirits and eager for conflict. Wharton, Russell, and Littleton maintained that the House ought to be satisfied with what the king had said. "Do you wish," said Littleton, "to make sport for your enemies? There was no want of them. They besiege our very doors. We read, as we come through the lobby, in the face and gestures of every nonjuror whom we pass, delight at the momentary coolness which has arisen between us and the king. That should be enough for us. We may be sure that we are voting rightly when we give a vote which tends to confound the hopes of traitors." The House divided. Harley was a teller on one side, Wharton on the other. Only 88 voted with Harley, 229 with Wharton. The Whigs were so much elated by their victory that some of them wished to move a vote of thanks to William for his gracious answer. But they were restrained by a wiser man. "We have lost time enough already in these unhappy debates," said a leader of the party. "Let us get to Ways and Means as fast as we can. The best form which our thanks can take is that for a money bill." Thus ended, more happily than William had right to expect, one of the most dangerous contests in which he ever engaged with his Parliament. At the Dutch embassy the rising and going down of this tempest had been watched with intense interest, and the opinion there seems to have been that the King had, on the whole, lost neither power nor popularity by his conduct. Another question, which excited scarcely less angry feelings in the Parliament and in the country, was, about the same time, under consideration. On the 6th of December, a Whig member of the House of Commons obtained leave to bring in a bill for the naturalization of foreign Protestants. Plausible arguments in favour of such a bill were not wanting. Great numbers of people, eminently industrious and intelligent, firmly attached to our faith, and deadly enemies of our deadly enemies, were at that time without a country. Among the Huguenots, who had fled from the tyranny of the French king, were many persons of great fame in war, in letters, in arts, and in sciences, and even the humblest refugees were intellectually and morally above the average of the common people of any kingdom in Europe. With French Protestants who had been driven into exile by the edicts of Louis, were now mingled German Protestants who had been driven into exile by his arms. Vienna, Berlin, Basel, Hamburg, Amsterdam, London, swarmed with honest laborious men who had once been thriving burghers of Heidelberg or Mannheim, or who had cultivated vineyards along the banks of the Neckar and the Rhine. A statesman might well think that it would be at once generous and politic to invite to the English shores and to incorporate with the English people immigrants so unfortunate and so respectable. Their ingenuity and their diligence could not fail to enrich any land which should afford them an asylum, nor could it be doubted that they would manfully defend the country of their adoption against him whose cruelty had driven them from the country of their birth. End of section 10. Recording by Hugh Gillis.